Well, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly, and we're going to resume our conversation with Don Meagher in this episode. We've set the groundwork there in terms of what the challenge is and what the dynamics that are compounding all of our problems in disaster response in these really troubling times and the impacts on our other security challenges that we face and the Defence Force, for example. But Don's done some incredibly deep work too on basically the broader issues around manufacturing, sovereign capability, national resilience, and how schemes might be created to deal with those issues, and that might be of some impact and benefit to our economy generally. So these are really important conversations because anything you discuss or decide that's going to happen in these types of situations has always got to be paid for. It's got to be thought through carefully as to how it does impact on the economy. So, Dom, can you take us through what was revealed in your work, what sort of study and work you did on those broader issues?
Sure, for sure. So the main thing we were focused on, I would say, is cost mitigation. Because the first thing to say is the cost of climate disasters is baked in. Right? The cost of climate change exists because the climate's changing. Right? And how we deal with that determines, first of all, how big that cost is and who bears it. But so dealing with that head on is better than standing back and being forced to make the choice that's left with it that we're left with at the end. Right? If we get out in front of it and face the challenge head on, you take the bull by the horn, so to speak. You can still make choices, right? When you've got a range of options available. If you wait until all your options are down to one and then act, that's not going to be the cheapest or the best one. Right? So the first thing is, I would say, we're looking at how can we do this relatively efficiently, manage this cost at the lowest possible cost and for the best benefit for us. So I touched on before, for instance, the impact on things like inflation or insurance, right? Floods come through, wipe out farms, wipe out houses. The cost of food goes up. The cost of home insurance goes up. You got to rebuild houses, so the cost of like the availability of houses goes up. Goes down, I should say. You suddenly got a whole lot of people that were in houses that aren't, and are now looking for somewhere to live in the middle of a housing crisis. Right? That's not a good situation.
Insurance aspect is a really important one, isn't it? Insurance is like the oil of the economy.
Yep, yep, absolutely. You look at a place like Lismore, right? There's people from Lismore, like, what, are we 4 or 5 years later, and they still aren't back in their homes? That cost is enormous, right? Just the cost of being dislocated from your life, right? Kids have gone through their entire school not in their proper school, uh, or not in their home. Um, those costs really add up if you don't have a way of dealing with them efficiently. So the first thing we were looking at is how do you get just a lot of people to mobilize all of a sudden and deal with a thing in a hurry, right? And you look at the Lismore situation in particular. The cleanup stage took a long time, right? Because there just wasn't the hands on deck, right? If you could get 10,000 people to descend into Lismore in an organized way and do the cleanup, you can get in a couple of weeks what would otherwise take a year, right? With 1,000 people or something like this, right? Or a few hundred people. And if you get 10 or 20,000, you're really getting things moving. If you've got farms, um, when the crops are put out and the fences are all washed away, sheds are knocked down. Some of that rebuild is pretty simple stuff. Fencing is not the most complex building construction project in the world.
Yeah, just on that one, that was a really significant thing in my patch, and a lot of farmers, dairy farmers in particular, who are a lot of family members of mine, but they couldn't afford the insurance costs for fence lines anymore. So you're talking about some of the costs of that back then. We're talking 2019 to 20. It was $100,000 a year to insure your fence line, and so they couldn't afford it. So there were very few farmers who had insured fence lines.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, if you could get um, something like a disasters reserves crew to rock up and help you rebuild a fence where you needed it. Operating on, and ideally that'd be local people or as local as you can. Because generally you want people working in local communities where they're known and they trust and they know the place, right? That builds more connections. But you just need a lot of people on deck, and if you can get that done quickly and get the farm back into operation quickly, that's keeping the cost down to the country, right? Of course, keeping the cost down to the country is one thing. Keeping the cost down to the budget is a separate matter. Um, yeah, you've got to get that money into the budget in order for it to get spent, uh, and that's done differently. We didn't go into any tax measures, but I'll just say the government has, I think, 425 billion over the next decade in the current budget, in the 2026 integrated investment program. And this is part of the sort of national defense strategy, is my understanding, in terms of goals to improve national civil preparedness. Right? I'm not 100% sure how all these, if I've related those things entirely correctly, but there's a lot of money going into this for civil preparedness, already, and because the government recognizes that there's a huge issue. Many aspects of the government are focused on this set of problems, right? And it's a broad set of problems. It's not just climate disasters. Civil preparedness goes to many things. You know, mis and disinformation, cybersecurity, all sorts of things, right? But climate disasters is a big part of it.
That includes the infrastructure resilience, doesn't it? I mean,
Yep.
when we
Yep.
ran out during those massive floods, we were all sent out, to go and look at various parts of Australia. You'd see the difference between a road that had been constructed with a bit more effort, but was still there, a road that was done, in a low cost way, which was gone, or old
Yeah.
bridges, built with the sort of engineering skills and techniques of 150 years ago, that were just gone,
Yeah.
etc.
hmm Look, and speaking of roads and bridges, I mean, I think we've all learned, or relearned the lesson that we all should have known after, at the very latest, the Brisbane floods, which told us that, if main arterial roads are cut off, you're disconnecting cities from farms, and food doesn't get to supermarket shelves. And then again, food price inflation. But in the meantime, and farms are not making money because they can't sell their product. Um, you know, and it's a huge cost. If you've got a team, a local team of engineers who are tied into a program where you can deploy them, to go and clear a road, or rebuild a bridge in a hurry. It doesn't have to be the best bridge in the world as long as it works quickly. You know, army standards will be fine in an emergency, right? Not to say army standards are bad, but the army standard is good enough to get the job done at the required specification, right?
It's
Which is not necessary. Yeah, right. I mean, if you need it done today, you do what you can do to get it done today, and it doesn't have to be the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Yeah, but this is where this debate about Build Back Better came into it, and is that actually okay? So it's an upfront cost, but in terms of all those savings that you have out the back end, in terms of the lightening the impact on the economy, that we're ready for basically anything, and then also that the costs of continually rebuilding something, and the impacts on insurance, all of that is a factor in that, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I wouldn't suggest that we should be aiming to do the cheapest version of things. If we can do something that is reliable and can resist these kind of disasters in the first place, that's even better. Right? You look at Japan, and they are like, their building standards are the best in the world for withstanding earthquakes, and there's a good reason for it, right? And it saves them a lot of grief, right, and cost. And if we want things that can survive fires and floods, we should build them that way. That should include drainage and along roads and things like this, right? And maintaining the drainage along roads. You see, even in Sydney, some of the local street corners just get flooded every time it rains because the drainage isn't maintained. Just that kind of stuff helps a lot. So, you but in terms of keeping the cost down, I think the first thing to recognize is that the cost exists, because of the risk, right? And so, how you manage the risk, how you manage the uh, let's say the devaluation of existing assets when they get destroyed or damaged. How you manage that is really where the cost savings come um, in terms of how you pay for it, and you can financialize that in a range of different ways that we didn't really get into that part of it. Um, so I think that's probably the first sort of set of thoughts I'd put on the table in terms of the cost side of things. Um, we already discussed a bit last time about you know, making defense more economical, right? So when you got a lot of priorities that overlap, coordinating them effectively means you can get the cost down through economies of scale and stuff like this. And there's a lot of sort of, I guess they call in government parlance co-benefits, in in terms of you know aligned priorities in diplomacy, in you know um, overcoming long-term disadvantage. I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration with Indigenous Australians, right? In programs like this, if you build in training on traditional knowledge as part of, a disaster resilience training program, that can go a long way. There's a whole host of ways you can get this cost down, but the first thing you got to recognize is that the cost exists because of the disasters, not because of responding to the disasters.
Yes, and your diplomacy point is such an important one. I mean, how do you build goodwill from top to bottom in our neighbours' structures, political and social, the people-to-people side of it? And I remember during the Asian currency crisis, when Australia weighed in heavily on that, it was amazing the feedback you got on how people just in the street, taxi drivers, accepted and understood the importance of it and were grateful for it. And Australia benefited greatly from that goodwill that was provided by that support. And then similarly, the most obvious thing in disasters and the response we made to, say, the tsunami, and the positive feedback from that. I mean, if we created the sort of capacities that we want in use year round, then obviously responding to the problems of our neighbours is a way of sweating those assets, but also building that goodwill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in defense, they'll often talk about the diplomacy as right in the American defense, they might call the State Department their additional aircraft carrier or something like this, right? Because this is how you prevent a conflict from spilling out in the first place, right? If you can deploy a diplomat instead of a marine contingent, that's much better.
Yeah.
Much
Talk about,
better.
yeah, well, they talk about the phases of operations 0 to 0. So start with 0, and then, there's the deterrence in phases 1, and then deployments, preventative deployments, and then actual combat operations, etc., until you come back to phase 0 again, which is, and the phase 0 part of it is that shaping aspect of it, creating an environment where conflicts don't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And before you even get to the diplomats, it's the people to people links, and these sort of civilian programs is how you make sure that we're you know, I mean, the biggest blessing Australia has is that our biggest neighbor, actually has 300 million Muslims, and we have no concept of threat from them. It's completely a friendly relationship.
In fact, it's building towards security cooperation.
Yeah,
As cooperation. So that's awesome.
absolutely. And when Albanese went up there recently, and the Indonesia had been dealing with some earthquakes and caused devastating impacts in Aceh and other places. And Albanese came down. I don't think that anyone had been briefed that this was going to happen, but he told Indonesian Prime Minister that we would be there for their reconstruction and their rebuilding financially. And he announced a significant package of support for rebuilding Aceh, and just the gratitude, I think, and relief that came with that was incredible.
It's also a way you build that kind of two-track sort of understanding in a soft way with all your regional militaries. And, we've focused for quite some time now on what I call DR, disaster response, and HA, humanitarian assistance. And so, that's a great way to pull together foreign militaries. And I participated in some of that to do exercises around that kind of thing in response. So,
Yeah,
terrific
absolutely.
crack of diplomacy, the player there. I've been in things where you got the Chinese, People's Liberation Army and, the US forces, etc., all involved in the same activity.
And look, here's another aspect of disaster resilience. The different type of disaster was, I think you mentioned right at the beginning, was COVID. And one of the things that we built as a country to deal with that were some pretty substantial quarantine facilities, especially up in around Darwin. And they've been used by international defense um, training um, to, and my understanding from seeing some of the US Marines talk about it, they've described our quarantine facilities as the best accommodation they'd ever experienced on a defense international defense training program. Um, and they couldn't wait to get back to doing more work in Australia because the facilities and just the way the experience was just so positive. Yes, we had these great facilities that were
Just on, just on that, this is the thing that really annoyed me in COVID was that we had a failed hotel quarantine system. It just failed. So Howard Springs was the most successful quarantine capability that we had.
Mhm.
And, remote, you couldn't get into the city. People were in separated accommodation with separate air conditioning
Mhm.
units and could move around and get exercise easily
Yeah,
in a manageable way. And you needed to isolate people for a couple of weeks. We could have rapidly expanded in an emergency fashion that facility to
mm,
deal with our complete quarantining problems if we build up, like, say, a stock of shipping containers that could be rapidly deployable, which could also be used, as temporary accommodation around the traps. But, the Chinese in COVID, they built a whole new hospital, in 10 days in Wuhan.
yeah, yeah.
And so to me, we could have mobilized to do that kind of thing and have that plan in place to do that, next time around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was saying some similar things at the time, pushing really hard to get more quarantine facilities built in a hurry. Um, and part of that is, I mean, you mentioned containerized construction. You Modular housing is a big, containerized and manufactured housing is really a essential part of getting the productivity of the housing sector to increase, right? If you can build things in a factory, you can do it much more efficiently than on site, and then just assume that inside. Yeah, absolutely. And then, I mean, this is slightly off topic, I guess, at this point, but then you can start having construction as an export industry, right? Which means you can start focusing on, really Australian materials and Australian standards as an export, brand, and get a bit more complexity into our export sector. But that's a bit of a you
But that's really, but that comes back to this point, right? How do you make it economical to do this disaster preparedness?
yeah, exactly. And the more priorities you can align, and the more um let's say economically useful activity you can align with your emergency response, the more affordable it is, right? Insurance, the cost you bear to deal with some unexpected situation, um, rather than which is always more expensive than just doing things the cheapest way, assuming it all goes correct. With no hiccups, right? If you build in some contingency, it's going to cost more, but until something goes wrong, and then you're going to be very glad for it. And these days, things seem to be going wrong a lot.
Yeah, well, the PPE challenge on the supply chain front, that was a really big one.
Mhm.
Yeah, so how do you turn a brewery into making sanitizers and, all the rest of
Yeah.
it? But, the problem for me is there's never been much planning around that. Like, how do we have like a national mobilization plan for the sorts of challenges we could face? And looking at the pandemic stuff, there was an immediate surge on how do we think about that. And some governments were looking at, for example, how do you do disease surveillance, monitoring, management, and all the technology tools. And I was aware of some of the tools that you could use Like the reason we got rapid rollout of vaccines was for the first time we kind of networked about 67 different medical research organisations, and we were able to ingest millions of anonymised patient data to sort of leapfrog over a lot of the delays in field
Mm.
trials, etc., and data, patient data, to get that happening. But then the emergency goes away, and all of a sudden they don't have the money for this and that and the other, and
Mhm.
other priorities take over. So I don't know how we overcome that.
Yeah, well, I'd say one thing is making sure that the solutions are logical. Some of the solutions we did in COVID, mostly I think it was very well done. Some of them, were, especially early on, were a little bit off the mark. Especially things like not letting people go outside in parks and beaches and stuff. Right, that's where you're basically safest is outdoors, where there's fantastic ventilation. Um, you know, we probably should have been keeping people in those kind of places as much as possible instead of saying you can't go there. Right. And, you know, in conversely, if they had acknowledged at the beginning the airborne nature of COVID, they would have promoted ventilation and outdoors and avoiding, confined spaces, rather than, this sort of 2-meter rule or, things like this. And, proper fitting respirators, N95 masks if you have to be indoors and can't find a well ventilated place. And you do that along with your, house brings style quarantine, and the risk goes way down at quite an affordable cost, right? If you do things like you mess out the quarantine and you give people the wrong kind of instructions to fit the situation, the cost goes up. So it's the same with these other kind of disasters, right? If your solution actually makes sense for the problem, it's going to work much more effectively, and you're going to have much more public support for it.
Well, part of it was too that we just needed time, right? You wanted to delay the spread of the disease to give the hospital system the ability to cope, and also to enable vaccines to intervene.
Yeah.
So it was a delay.
Well,
At
that, that
operation.
yeah, get me a little bit of a probably horse at the moment, but this was that vaccine waiting period, right? When we knew we were waiting for vaccines, uh, and we knew that from the very beginning, and we knew from the very beginning it was going to take about 18 to 24 months, right? That was public knowledge from mid March in 2020. Yeah, uh, and at that time, Scott Morrison was out there saying, you know, the sort of lockdowns and border control would be 6 months. Right? We'd all be back to work in 6 months, and there was no rationale for that because we knew that we had to wait for vaccines. So we knew it was going to be 18 months at least. And so all the programs were designed for a sort of 6 month period instead of an 18-month period, and they became much more expensive than they should have been. So there was things like this that just were done wrongly, when at the time we should have known better. On the whole, I think we did pretty well, better than 90% of countries. Um, but there are things that we should have definitely done better. And then now we get the Australia formulas, right? And all of a sudden people are asking again. And things like questions from COVID era, like what are the essential services? Who needs petrol? Do we have a list of who we have to um, supply if we have to switch to a sort of emergency economy rather than a standard economy? And these kind of questions that pop up, and I guess if you've thought about it in advance, you've got a bit of systems in place, you can manage that relatively quickly. If you try to do it, rebuild the plane while it's falling, it's not going to be done very well.
Yeah, we talked about this with Justin Howden, the fuel insecurity issue that we face, and the contrast with, say, Sweden, which set up their commission on achieving independence from oil back in 2005, of them been really intentionally working towards that, and they've achieved great progress because they were worried about their being too dependent on Russia, for example. But that seems to be a bit of a problem we have in Australia, is not being able to have that sustainment of intention around how we plan and deliberately prepare, and perhaps eliminate vulnerabilities, in a manageable way. But also the benefits. So COVID was another example where in the UK and the US, I was very close to that issue, that the system, the hospital system, needed to be logistically enhanced as well and improved. So the ability to manage that and to do things like theatre management, patient prioritization, preventative stuff, putting in place the systems to do that made the whole of the NHS and even systems in the US much more economic. They were cost saving measures that, and what bigger challenge do we have in Australia than trying to make our health systems more efficient and save costs? When we look at the NDIS in that space as well, where it was bleeding, but it just seems to me you lose that intention to actually set the plan in place. And in the military, we had this system, at tactical level at least, where you have, say, in the first division where I was, you've got an operations cell, which is managing current operations. And then you have a future plan cell, which is looking at your kind of over horizon next step stuff and future planning. So, where is that, in our universe?
Yeah, but, well, look, I would say, I said two things. Prevention is so much cheaper than cleanup, right? And on the health side of things, the preventative health budget in Australia is 1.5% of the total health budget. Right? So we spend, from memory, about 230 billion a year on health, and that's about uh, it's 3 billion of that goes into preventative health, and in that 3 billion or so, I think it's a bit less, 2.8 or something. Um, half of it roughly is vaccine programs, and half of it roughly is advertising campaigns, public awareness kind of things. You know, reminders for people to get bowel cancer checks. I just got one of those this week. I'm that at that age. Yeah, yeah, but well, yes, yeah, you've certainly been through that. The yeah, breast cancer screenings, like these kind of things, they put a bit of budget into, and it saves so much to find this stuff early. Right? The cost of prevention is so much lower than the cost of dealing with the problem after it develops. And that's true in many fields, right? And the bottom line is 1.5% is less than optimal in terms of economic optimization. Right? You're going to save a lot of money by putting more of your spending into prevention than we currently are. It doesn't have to get to 50%, but a lot of estimates I've seen reckon that that's about where it should be. That involves 25 times more spending on prevention, uh, and 40% less on dealing with it. But if you're doing that, you're going to need 40% less to deal with it because you're just not going to have the same amount of problem. Yeah, and you'll probably be able to either lower your overall costs quite substantially, or be dealing with many more problems. Like less lower priority things become affordable.
And part of it's like understanding what the vulnerabilities are and where those preventions can happen. And so I look at things like the research you do on where we're building houses, for example, and where we shouldn't be building houses, and modelling fire lines and floodline predictions, and being able to sort of address the understanding of dynamics around population centres and what measures you take in that respect. But also, like on the health front, I know there's a project out at the University of Canberra, but it's digital health project, which has got tremendous potential because it really unpacks for you precisely the nature of mortality issues and health issues in the landscape of Australia and what the dynamics around that are, and social, economic, and the nutritional, all these elements to it. You understand all of these things, and then as a policymaker, you can go away and actually start constructing effective, meaningful policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other part of the prevention stuff though is more into our actual subjects than the health stuff is the disaster side of things. Um, but also on actual defense, military defense, right? So defense budget is what, 60 something billion a year, roughly, which is, I think I'm supporting for it to go up, but because the issues we have to deal with are increasing. But the DFAT budget is about 4.5 billion a year, right? And I think that includes the aid program. half of that being the aid program and half of that being a diplomacy and trade program. So trade promotion as well is in there, I think. Um, the diplomacy part of it, I think, is in the region of 1.5 billion. Um, and that's the sort of preventative side of conflict, right? That's the advancing our interests and the shaping agenda, right? Or part of it at least, that you were talking about, right? Shaping the environment to make sure the conflicts don't emerge. Um, we can put a fair bit more effort there. It doesn't all have to come through the DFAT budget necessarily. Um, if it's emergency management stuff, then that might be a separate budget, and maybe it's already happening to an extent. And I'm not including it, so maybe it's a little bit unfair of me to do it that way. But it gives you a sense of how much we're spending on prevention rather than response. And I think there's if we're talking about the economics, prevention is definitely going to be cheaper. If you can, the challenge is having some kind of reliable case that the type of prevention you're doing is the right kind of prevention. The advantage of responding to a problem is that this is the problem you need to respond to because it's already happened, right? You can prove to an accountant that this was definitely worth doing. Prevention, you're sort of guessing at what the problem's going to be. So that's that's what maybe makes it harder to get people to act on, right? A possible thing is much harder to convince people of than a thing that definitely happened.
Yeah, one part of this is how do you build the social license on the one side of it, and how do you build the bipartisanship, which plays into the social license. So if you've got, opposition parties of whatever colour, you're running around trying to take advantage of sort of a lack of understanding or knowledge about a particular issue, and that corrodes social license. You can never get anything done, and our 3-year, sort of election cycles also interfere with that from a federal point of view. But, I think that's one of the things we have to actually focus on here. If we want to have more effective disaster responses, what are the kind of processes and structures, mechanisms we can institute that helps build that consensus, political consensus aspect of it, like to quarantine off, areas of debate that and I've seen this like in Europe. You've had pretty much consensus on climate change action right across the political spectrum. I mean, the first politician who really spoke loudly on the issue was Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Right? But David Cameron, Angela Merkel, they're all on board with just how do we do this effectively, economically, etc. How do we create those kind of platforms in Australia is probably the next conversation we can have. But thanks very much for unpacking this all, Dom. I really appreciate it, mate. There's a lot of work that you've done this and you're continuing to do in your current job. I'm so pleased that Crawford School is taking advantage of all of that depth. And hopefully we can promote more of that research and understanding getting into the public and political sphere. So thanks for talking with us over these couple of weeks, mate. But we'll definitely come back to you again because there's so much to unpack.
Yeah, I'd love that. That'd be great. I know we're out of time, but I was just going to check in. One of the things I've been teaching my students as they write about climate policy is Mike Moore's strategic triangle, which goes right to what you are talking about. Your policy has to be analytically sound, but it also has to be politically viable and administratively viable. Right? You got to be able to do it. You got to be able to tell people that is what we should be doing. And if you can't do both of those things, you don't have a theoretically good policy. You've got a policy that's going to fail or get unwound shortly, and that's not the best policy, right? So you got to make sure you have all aspects of that for sure. But yeah, it's been great talking with you, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get into some more of these things in another chance.
Oh, we definitely will, mate, as long as we're both upright. But and you finished off with the most important point there, so thanks for that. You put a real sort of exclamation mark on the end of it. And look, for everybody else, thanks for being with us for this conversation. Really look forward to talking more about the issues that really matter to people's daily lives in that sort of human security realm. And we'll be with you again next time. So cheers.